It's Wednesday, June 3rd, 2020. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 9, the Apostle Paul wrote, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich." We've been looking at that verse through the lens of a story from 2 Samuel chapter 9 about a man named Mephibosheth. And I really wish that Mephibosheth had a nickname, but what can you do? Mephibosheth was physically impaired because, as an infant, he'd been dropped by one of his father's servants. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, the man who was King David's closest friend. The law of the land at the time forbid anyone who was impaired from appearing before the king, and to ignore that law meant punishment, imprisonment, and even possibly death to the impaired person. Yet despite that, Mephibosheth had a guaranteed place at the king's table all day, every day, for the rest of his life. And we've been saying that Mephibosheth wasn't punished for appearing before the king, and that's called mercy. But beyond that, Mephibosheth was rewarded the right to sit at the king's table, and that's called grace. Mercy is not getting the punishment we deserve, and grace is getting the reward that we don't deserve. That's directly tied to the passage that we've been looking at, because Jesus was rich and became poor. He became poor by taking our punishment for us. That's what the mercy of God accomplished for us. But we were poor and became rich because of Jesus' poverty. We became rich by picking up what Jesus set aside when he came to earth. That's what the grace of God accomplished for us. So we're on a hunt. We're on a hunt to discover what Jesus set aside so that we could pick it up. And today that journey begins with a painful childhood memory for me. I grew up in the northeastern corner of the state of Massachusetts, very near the New Hampshire line. And no, I never parked my car in Harvard Yard because I was smart enough to stay out of Harvard Yard with my car because it was wicked expensive to park there, even if you parked around the corner. And yeah, that's how I used to sound when I talked. Anyway, I didn't come here to tell you all that. I grew up in Massachusetts, north of Boston, in a small town called Tewksbury. We lived on Bailey Road, and Bailey Road intersected with Fisk Street. And that's important because when I was 6 years old, a construction crew began building a house on Fisk Street just around the corner from where I lived. My friend Steve lived right next door to me, and he was 2 weeks older than I was. Two 6-year-olds in a construction site. What could go wrong? I still remember the morning that we heard the hammering and sawing going on up around the corner there on Fisk, and decided that we just had to ride our bikes over there and see what was going on. Steve had a 20-inch bike with wide tires, and I rode a sportier 18-inch at the time. We parked our bikes a fair distance from the house under construction and sat in the tall grass to watch. I spent most of that day amazed. In fact, I'm not sure that to this day that I've ever been more amazed or more fascinated than I was by the construction of that 2-story house when I was 6 years old. We kept going back, and soon we were sitting in the very yard where the construction was happening, and then came the day when the foreman of the job asked us if we wanted to help. I wish that all the questions that people ask now were as simple to answer as that question was that day. "Yes, please," we said, trying to sound polite. To the best of my knowledge, it was a Thursday when we began our construction careers by picking up the bent nails that the guys dropped on the floor. We weren't allowed to get too close to the workers, but when they'd finish in an area, we'd go to work picking up and sweeping and stuff, and we did the same thing on Friday, and then it was Saturday morning. And as 6-year-olds, we were totally unfamiliar with the concept of the work week, so we weren't prepared for the fact that no one showed up that Saturday morning to work on the house. No one, that is, except we two 6-year-olds. So we looked at each other and agreed that the guys would be there any minute, and we had important responsibilities, so we decided to go into the house and get started. So now we were no longer two 6-year-olds on a construction site. We were two 6-year-olds alone on a construction site. And again, I ask you, what could go wrong? Anyway, we abandoned our bikes right outside the front door and went inside and actually got to work. We worked for maybe 15 minutes when we heard a vehicle pull up outside, and we expected that it was one of the construction workers who had arrived, finally, to start the day. Except that the vehicle that had pulled up outside had flashing red and blue lights on top of it. And this is where you might find it difficult to believe me, but up until that very second, it hadn't occurred to me that two 6-year-olds alone on a construction site might possibly be misinterpreted. Steve seemed to figure it out before I did and made a dash for his bike. He somehow avoided the police officer and tore out of there like a scalded dog. I knew Steve until we graduated from high school, and in the years that followed, I'm confident that I never saw him move as fast as he did that day. And he did all that while I continued to stand there, frozen to the spot, with a handful of bent nails. Suddenly there was a deep, booming voice coming over a megaphone. "Throw down the nails and come out with your hands up." I've realized since that there was probably no megaphone and no harsh voice, and no way that he could have known that I was holding nails in my hands. But it was years before I figured that out. In any event, I started a mantra in my head and kept silently repeating to myself, "Throw down the nails, don't throw up the breakfast. Throw down the nails, don't throw up the breakfast. Throw down the nail..." Well, you get it. I'd watched enough cop shows on TV to know what to do. I threw down my nails and walked to the front door with my hands up. The policeman walked toward me as I jumped down out of the front door, and as I stood on his level, we were suddenly face to face. Well, not really face to face, because you have to picture this. I was less than 4 feet tall at the time, and I was being confronted by a police officer who was no less than 14 feet tall. As I stood there, I realized that I had no idea what was about to happen, but I was pretty sure I wasn't going to like it. As it began to unfold, there was only one thought running through my mind. Don't pee your pants. Don't pee your pants. Don't pee your pants. I didn't want to pee my pants because I was pretty sure that I was going to jail, and I assumed that the other criminals would laugh at me if I arrived with wet pants. Well, the officer took out his clipboard and started asking questions. He asked me what my name was, so I told him, and he wrote it down in his book. And then he asked me where I lived, so I told him my address, and he wrote that down too. And then he asked me the scariest question of all. What were the names of my mother and father? I froze. Not because I didn't know their first names, but out of pure fear. Suddenly, I was no longer afraid that he would take me to jail, but I was spitlessly terrified that he would tell my mom. I wanted to beg with him. I wanted to say, "Please, I'll go to that Alcatraz place if you send me there, but please, don't tell my mommy." Then he asked me what I was doing there in the house, and I told him that the construction guys had said that I should pick up nails because they needed my help. I even explained to him that this was my job now, and I needed to get it done. And for some reason, he seemed to believe me, at least enough for him to call the dispatcher on his radio, who then, I guess, called the construction company. The construction company somehow knew about the arrangement and told the officer that I was telling the truth and that I was a good kid. How little they knew. Eventually, the officer told me that I could go, but then he made me promise that I wouldn't come back when the crew wasn't there, and I assured him that this debacle would never happen again, and got on my bike and cried all the way home. And to my credit, I did not throw up my breakfast, and I did not pee my pants. I was an instant celebrity in the neighborhood. I was still 6 years old, but I was the only kid with a criminal record. And while it was fun to get that kind of recognition from the other kids, I lived in fear for my life, thinking that my mother would read about my criminal exploits in the newspaper. So for the next week, I waited for the paperboy and got the newspaper from him and then promptly threw it away. That meant that my mother never read the story and never found out what I did, but it also meant that my father wandered around the house every day saying, "I wonder why they're not delivering the newspaper anymore." I've never forgotten that day, now nearly 60 years ago. And I wanted to share that with you today because it helps me to understand grace. It's an amusing story, but it's also sobering when you think about my sort of criminal record, especially when you consider how young I was when I started my life of crime. The thought of that 14-foot tall officer writing down the record of my crimes is amusing today, but it was terrifying at the time. Well, it took a long time to tell a short story, and our time is just about up. So I'd like to suggest that you take some time for prayer. That officer wrote down an account of what he had caught me doing, and I don't know how long records like that are kept, but it amuses me to think that it might be possible that somewhere in a paper box in a back room in the Tewksbury Police Department in Massachusetts, there may still be a record of my crime that day. I don't know if you're aware of this, but God writes things down too. He has books where he keeps record of every deed we've ever done and every sin we've ever committed. And that prompts me to ask, what sorts of things do you suppose are on your record in God's books? As you pray, ask God to enlighten you about that. But then open your Bible and read 2 Corinthians 8:9. Ask God to help you to begin to see how the truth of that verse impacts the records that God keeps on every one of us. Let's talk again tomorrow.